Jinho watched the giant screen in the Earth Embassy command room, as numbers rolled across the display like falling rain, and each number meant death for human dreams of reaching the stars. And his hands gripped the metal chair so hard his knuckles turned white as the final vote appeared in bright red letters that seemed to burn into his eyes. 847 votes for the motion, and only 3 against it, and humanity was now officially banned from leaving their home solar system. Forever. The Galactic Council chamber looked like a massive cathedral made of crystal and metal with thousands of alien beings sitting in floating chairs that glowed with soft blue light, and at the center stood Chancellor Vorthak, whose 6 arms moved like dancing snakes as he spoke words that would change everything for every human alive. Jinho had been Earth's ambassador to the Council for 12 years, and he had seen many votes, but never one like this, and never one that felt like watching his own execution in slow motion while being powerless to stop it. The translation device in his ear buzzed with Vorthak's deep voice as the Chancellor began reading the official decree, and every word felt like a hammer blow against Jinho's chest. Humans are declared a restricted species due to their dangerous influence on galactic civilization, and all human travel beyond the Sol system is hereby prohibited, effective immediately, and any human found outside their designated area will be returned to Earth or eliminated if return is not possible. Subin burst through the embassy doors like a storm wind, and her military uniform was wrinkled as if she had been running, and her dark eyes blazed with anger that could melt steel. They cannot do this to us, and we have rights under galactic law, and we have colonies on 17 worlds with millions of people who will be trapped forever. Jinho turned from the screen and looked at his old friend who had served as Earth's military intelligence chief for the past 8 years. And he saw fear behind her anger because they both knew the Council could do exactly what they wanted. The evidence they presented was real, even if their interpretation was wrong. And humans had indeed changed every world they touched, but not in the way the Council claimed. Dongmin entered the room, carrying a thick file of papers, and his scientist mind was already working on the problem like a puzzle that needed solving. And his calm voice cut through the tension like a gentle breeze. I have been studying the Council's evidence for 3 months, and their data shows that human influence spreads faster than any biological virus they have ever documented. He opened his file and spread papers across the conference table, and each page showed charts and graphs that told the story of human expansion across the galaxy. On Kepler 442b, the mining productivity increased by 400% after humans introduced the concept of worker safety and job satisfaction, and the alien workers began asking questions about their rights for the first time in their species. History on Proxima Centauri C. The war between the northern and southern continents ended when human negotiators taught both sides about compromise and peaceful conflict resolution. On Wolf 359b, the entire planetary government changed from a monarchy to a democracy after the population learned about voting and representation from human teachers. The Chancellor's voice continued from the screen as he listed example after example of human contamination, and his words made it sound like humans were a disease that needed to be contained. The worst case occurred on TRAPPIST-1F, where humans introduced the concept of individual, artistic expression, and within 2 years the entire planet had abandoned their traditional role-based society in favor of personal choice and creative freedom. Subin slammed her fist on the table hard enough to make the papers jump, and her voice shook with controlled rage. They make it sound like we are destroying their cultures, but we are helping them grow and become better versions of themselves. Dongmin nodded and pointed to another chart that showed population happiness indexes on worlds with human contact. Every single planet shows increased satisfaction rates after human contact, and suicide rates drop by an average of 60%, and birth rates increase because people begin to hope for better futures for their children. Truth was that humans had not conquered or invaded or forced anyone to change, and they had simply lived among other species and shared their ideas about freedom and choice and personal growth, and somehow those ideas had spread like seeds on fertile ground. Jinho remembered his first day as ambassador when he had met with Chancellor Vorthak in a private meeting, and the alien leader had seemed genuinely curious about human culture and had asked many questions about Earth's history and development back. Then Vorthak had praised human innovation and called them valuable contributors to galactic society. But that was before the reports started coming in from every corner of the galaxy about worlds changing in ways the Council could not control or predict. The screen showed footage from the Council chamber as representatives from hundreds of species stood to speak about the human problem, and their words painted a picture of chaos and destruction that bore no resemblance to the truth. Jin-Ho, a tall blue-skinned delegate from the Rigel system, claimed that humans had poisoned his people's minds with dangerous ideas about questioning authority, and now his planet faced constant rebellion and unrest. A crystalline being from the Vega colonies accused humans of teaching her people to value individual happiness over collective duty, and warned that their entire civilization might collapse if the infection continued to spread. One after another they stood and spoke about human influence as if it were a plague that threatened the very foundations of galactic order and stability. But Jin-Ho had visited many of these worlds, and he had seen the changes with his own eyes, and they were not the disasters these delegates described. On the Rigel world he had watched formerly enslaved workers organize peaceful protests that led to better working conditions and fair wages, and the rebellion they feared was simply people asking to be treated with dignity. In the Vega colonies he had seen artists creating beautiful works that expressed personal emotions and experiences, instead of following ancient formulas, and the happiness they condemned was helping their people discover who they truly were beneath centuries of rigid social control. Subin was reading intelligence reports on her tablet, and her expression grew darker with each page. Our spy networks report that the Council has been planning this for over a year, and they have been gathering evidence and building support among member species who fear change. The energy barrier is already under construction, and it will completely surround our solar system within 6 months. And once it is active, no ship will be able to enter or leave. Dongmin looked up from his papers with a strange expression that might have been hope or might have been fear. There is something else in the data that the Council may not have noticed, and the rate of change on human-contacted worlds is accelerating even after humans leave. He pulled out a final chart that showed cultural shift measurements over time, and the lines on the graph looked like exponential curves reaching toward infinity. Ideas do not need physical presence to survive and spread, and the concepts humans have introduced are now spreading from species to species without any human involvement at all. Jin-Ho felt a chill run down his spine as he realized what Dongmin was suggesting. And if human ideas were spreading on their own, then the Council's plan to contain humanity might already be too late. The vote was finished and the decision was final, and humanity was now officially prohibited from the stars. But the seeds they had planted across the galaxy were already growing in ways no one could predict or control. As the Council chamber emptied and alien delegates returned to their ships, Jin-Ho wondered if they truly understood what they had just done, and whether their attempt to preserve galactic order might actually be the first step toward its complete transformation. The screen went dark and the embassy fell silent except for the soft hum of life support systems, and the three humans sat in the darkness knowing that their species had just been caged but unsure whether the cage was meant to keep humans in or to keep something else out. 6 months had passed since the Council's prohibition, and Hae-Jin stood in the cargo bay of Mining Station 7 on Kepler 442b, pretending to check inventory reports while her heart pounded like a war drum against her ribs, because today everything would change forever. The mining station buzzed with activity as alien workers loaded precious metals into transport ships bound for the inner worlds, and none of them knew that the quiet human woman with the clipboard had been living a lie for the past 3 years. Ye-Jin had told everyone she was a trade coordinator from the Tau Ceti colonies, and her forged identification papers were perfect copies that could fool even Council security scanners. But the truth was far more dangerous than anyone suspected. Her real name was Hae-Jin Park, and she had been born on Earth 32 years ago, and she was part of a network that stretched across the galaxy like an invisible web connecting hundreds of worlds through shared secrets and hidden purposes. The message had come through quantum encryption during the night shift when the station was nearly empty, and only the automated systems were running, and the words appeared on her private screen in Korean characters that glowed like tiny stars against the black background. Operation Dawn has begun, and all cells are activated, and the Council believes they have caged us, but they do not know how far we have already spread. And it is time to reveal the truth. Hae-Jin deleted the message immediately, and walked to her quarters trying to look calm while her mind raced with implications because the message meant that humans were about to show the galaxy something that would shake the foundations of everything. The council believed her quarters were small and basic. Like all station housing, but hidden behind a false panel was equipment that could reach across vast distances of space and connect her to people she had never met in person, but trusted with her life. She activated the quantum communicator and waited for the network to come online, and one by one voices began speaking in the encrypted channel as cells reported their status from across the galaxy. Tejo here from the Vega Mining Consortium, and I have been posing as a Zephyrian merchant for 12 years. And my trade routes connect 47 worlds, and no one suspects that my cargo ships carry more than just goods. Young Mai checking in from the Rigel shipyards, and I have been working as an engineer for 8 years, and the innovations I have introduced have increased efficiency by 300%. And my alien colleagues think I am from the Andromeda colonies. Wujin, speaking from the educational district on Proxima Centauri. And I have been teaching alien children for 6 years, and they call me Professor Kim. And they think I am from a distant star system, but I have been showing them how to question and dream and imagine better futures. The voices continued as dozens, and then hundreds of operatives reported their positions, and Heejin felt a mixture of pride and terror as she realized the true scope of what humans had accomplished while the Council had been counting their official colonies. They were not conquerors, or invaders, or even immigrants in the traditional sense, and they were teachers and healers and innovators who had been quietly working to make every world they touched a little bit better than they found. Tejo had introduced fair trade practices that protected small merchants from exploitation by large corporations, and his example had spread to dozens of worlds where alien traders began demanding honest contracts and reasonable terms. Young Mai had developed new safety protocols that reduced workplace accidents by 90%, and her designs were now standard across the Rigel system. And workers on other worlds were beginning to ask why their employers did not care about their well-being. Wu Jin had taught children to ask questions, instead of simply accepting what adults told them, and those children were now young adults who questioned unfair laws and demanded explanations for traditions that no longer served their communities. But the most important discovery was that these changes were not dependent on human presence, and the ideas had taken root and were growing on their own, like living things that fed on hope and curiosity and the desire for something better. The network coordinator was a woman named Mi Young who spoke with the authority of someone who had been planning this moment for decades, and her voice carried across the quantum channel with crystal clarity. The Council's prohibition has triggered exactly what we hoped it would, and alien species across the galaxy are beginning to rebel against their authority, and they are using human concepts like freedom and democracy and individual rights to justify their actions. She transmitted data files that showed protests and uprisings on over 200 worlds, and in every case the rebels were demanding things that had not existed in their vocabularies before human contact. On the Tyrillian homeworld, the ancient caste system was crumbling as lower-class citizens demanded equal treatment and fair representation in government decisions that affected their lives. The hyper-logical Nexari had begun creating art for the first time in their species' history, and their mathematical minds were discovering that beauty and emotion could coexist with reason and order. The militaristic Bralics were questioning the wisdom of constant warfare, and some of their generals had begun suggesting that conquest might be less valuable than cooperation and trade. My Young continued with reports that made Hyojin feel like she was watching history unfold in real time, and every word confirmed that human influence had spread far beyond what anyone had imagined possible. The most significant development is that multiple species are demanding representation in the Council itself, and they are using human political concepts to argue that taxation without representation is tyranny, and that governments derive their power from the consent of the governed. Yunbi, a former Council translator who had secretly joined the human cause years ago, provided intelligence about the Council's internal discussions, and her information painted a picture of growing panic among the galactic leadership. They are calling emergency sessions every day, and Chancellor Vorthak has ordered a complete review of all human contact over the past 50 years, and they are beginning to realize that their understanding of human activities was incomplete. The Council had tracked official human colonies and diplomatic missions, but they had no idea about the network of individuals who had been living under false identities and working quietly to plant seeds of change wherever they went. Yunbi reported that some council members were beginning to question whether the prohibition had been a mistake, and whether humans might actually be valuable allies rather than dangerous threats. But the hardliners led by Vorthak were pushing for more extreme measures, and they were developing plans that would not just contain humanity, but actively work to reverse human influence wherever it had taken root. Project Purification was already in development, and it involved systematic elimination of human ideas through education campaigns and memory modification technology, and in extreme cases the removal of alien leaders who had been contaminated by human concepts. The network fell silent as everyone absorbed the implications of this news, and He-Jin felt a cold fear settle in her stomach, because she knew that many of the aliens who had embraced human ideas would die before they would give up their newfound freedom. But Mi Young's voice returned with a strength that cut through the fear like sunlight through storm clouds. The Council believes they are fighting against human expansion, but they do not understand what they are really facing, and we are not trying to conquer the galaxy or impose our will on other species. We are offering them a choice, and once someone has experienced real freedom and genuine hope, they will not willingly return to oppression and ignorance. The truth is that human nature is not something unique to our species, and it is simply consciousness awakening to its own potential, and every sentient being in the galaxy has the capacity for growth and change and self-determination. The quantum channel began buzzing with activity as operatives across the galaxy reported new developments, and it became clear that the Council's prohibition had not contained human influence, but had actually accelerated its spread. Alien species who had never heard of humans were beginning to ask questions about the ideas that were spreading among their neighbors, and the concepts of freedom and democracy were becoming viral infections that jumped from world to world without any human involvement. He-Jin realized that the Council had made a fundamental error in their understanding of what humans represented, and they thought they were dealing with a biological species that could be contained through physical barriers. But human ideas had already evolved beyond their creators and were now living independently in the minds and hearts of billions of alien beings who had discovered that they were capable of more than they had ever imagined. The network coordinator signed off with instructions for the next phase of operations, and her final words echoed in He-Jin's mind long after the channel went silent. The Council wanted to cage humanity, but they have actually freed something much more powerful than any single species, and they are about to discover that consciousness itself cannot be contained once it begins to awaken. He-Jin powered down her equipment and returned the false panel to its proper position and walked back to her job in the cargo bay, where alien workers continued their tasks, unaware that the quiet human woman with the clipboard was part of something that would reshape their entire. Kyung-ho sat in the hidden monitoring station, deep within an asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter, where banks of computers tracked millions of communication signals across the galaxy, and today those signals carried news that would have seemed impossible just 1 year ago. The screens around him flickered with data streams from hundreds of worlds, and each transmission told part of a story that was rewriting the very foundations of galactic civilization, while the Council remained blind to the true scope of what was happening. 3 years had passed since the prohibition, and the energy barrier around Earth's solar system hummed with deadly power, but the changes it was meant to prevent were accelerating beyond all predictions. And B's voice crackled through the encrypted channel from her position inside Council headquarters, where she continued to work as a translator while secretly feeding intelligence to the human network. The Tyrillian Empire is in complete chaos, and their rigid caste system has collapsed after the lower classes organized strikes that shut down their entire industrial sector, and they are demanding a new government based on democratic principles. Kyung-ho watched the data feeds from Tyrillian space and saw images of massive crowds filling city streets while banners displayed words written in human languages that had been translated into thousands of alien scripts. Freedom and equality and justice had become battle cries that echoed across worlds where such concepts had never existed before human contact, and the ideas were spreading faster than any biological contagion. The Nexari homeworld showed even more dramatic changes as a species known for pure logic and mathematical precision. had begun creating art galleries and music festivals and poetry competitions that celebrated individual expression over collective conformity. Jae-sung's philosophical writings had somehow reached Nexari scholars through underground networks, and his essays about the relationship between reason and emotion had sparked a cultural revolution that transformed their entire society. Young Nexari, who had never known anything but calculated efficiency, were now painting murals that expressed personal feelings and composing songs about dreams and aspirations that had no logical purpose but filled their creators with joy. The militaristic Bralics presented perhaps the most shocking transformation as warrior clans that had fought constant battles for territorial expansion began questioning the value of conquest, and some had even declared permanent ceasefires. Their greatest generals were studying human military history and learning about concepts like defensive warfare and just war theory, and the protection of civilian populations during conflicts. Reports indicated that Bralics youth were refusing to join traditional warrior academies and instead demanding education in engineering and medicine and artistic pursuits that could build rather than destroy. Be transmitted classified council documents that revealed the growing panic among galactic leadership as they watched their carefully maintained order crumble under pressure from ideas they could not contain. Chancellor Vorthak has ordered psychological evaluations for all council members to ensure they have not been contaminated by human thinking, and 3 representatives have already been removed from office for expressing sympathy with democratic reforms. The council's response was becoming increasingly desperate as they realized that their prohibition had not only failed to contain human influence, but had actually made it more appealing to species that were beginning to see humans as symbols of freedom. Intelligence. Reports showed that human names and symbols were being used by rebel groups across the galaxy, even on worlds where no human had ever set foot, and the ideas had taken on lives of their own. Kyung-ho pulled up communication intercepts from the Centauri colonies where alien resistance leaders were calling themselves names like Freedom Kim and Democracy Park, while organizing peaceful protests against authoritarian governments. The most significant development was that multiple species were beginning to communicate with each other about their shared experiences with human concepts, and they were discovering that freedom and self-determination were universal desires. A massive interspecies alliance was forming based not on conquest or trade, but on shared political ideals, and the participating worlds were calling themselves the Liberation Coalition. The coalition included over 400 different species from every corner of the galaxy, and their only common ground was their exposure to human ideas about individual rights and democratic governance. Yunbi's intelligence painted a picture of a council that was fracturing under pressure as member species began demanding explanations for policies they had never been allowed to question. The core worlds are experiencing mass demonstrations as populations learn about the concept of taxation without representation, and they are demanding direct voting rights in council decisions that affect their home systems. Some council representatives are beginning to support reforms while others are calling for military action against the rebellion. And Vorthak is struggling to maintain unity among factions that are pulling in opposite directions. Kyung-ho switched to monitoring feeds from Earth where Jinho and Subin were coordinating humanity's response to the galactic crisis, while working within the constraints of their solar prison. The energy barrier prevented physical travel, but human quantum communication networks could still reach across vast distances and maintain contact with operatives throughout the galaxy. Subin had been analyzing council military movements, and her reports indicated that they were preparing for large-scale intervention against worlds showing signs of human contamination. They are calling it Project Purification, and the plan involves systematic destruction of libraries and educational institutions that contain human literature, and the arrest or elimination of alien leaders who promote democratic reforms. Military fleets are being assembled at strategic points throughout the galaxy, and the Council has authorized the use of memory modification technology to erase human influence from entire populations. But Kyung-ho's data analysis suggested that the Council's military solution would backfire spectacularly because forced suppression of ideas would only prove their value to populations that were already questioning authority. Jinho had been working with xenopsychologists to understand how different species would respond to oppression, and his predictions were both hopeful and terrifying. Species that have tasted freedom will not willingly return to subjugation, and any attempt to force them back into compliance will trigger massive resistance movements that could tear the galaxy apart. The irony is that the Council's heavy-handed response will accomplish what peaceful human influence could never achieve, and it will unite every free-thinking being in the galaxy against a common enemy. Kyung-ho received an urgent transmission from Jae-sung, who had been monitoring philosophical networks across multiple star systems, and his report confirmed humanity's worst fears and greatest hopes. Human concepts are evolving beyond their original forms, and alien species are developing new ideas based on freedom and democracy that go further than anything humans ever imagined. The Nexari have created mathematical proofs that demonstrate the logical necessity of individual rights, and their equations are being shared across academic networks throughout the galaxy. The former warrior clans of Bralex have developed military strategies for protecting democratic societies from authoritarian threats, and they are teaching these techniques to liberation movements everywhere. Young Tyrillian philosophers are writing new theories about the relationship between government and individual conscience that make human political science look primitive by comparison. The transformation was happening faster than anyone had predicted, and human ideas were not just spreading, but were being improved and expanded by alien minds that approached the concepts from completely different perspectives. Yunbi reported that the Council was beginning to realize the true scope of what they faced, and some members were talking about complete withdrawal from all human-influenced regions, rather than attempting to fight an unwinnable war. But Vorthak and his hardline supporters remained committed to Project Purification, and they believed that sufficient force could restore the old order if applied quickly and decisively. The final piece of intelligence came from deep space monitoring stations that detected massive fleet movements as the Council prepared to implement their solution to the human problem. Over 10,000 warships were converging on key systems throughout the galaxy, and their orders were to restore order through any means necessary, including the complete destruction of worlds that could not be purified. Kyung-ho realized that the galaxy was about to witness either the death of freedom or the birth of something entirely new, and the outcome would depend on whether the ideas humans had planted were strong enough to survive the coming storm. He sent a final message to all network operatives, warning them about the approaching fleets, while also sharing data that filled him with quiet confidence about the ultimate outcome. The Council thinks they are fighting against human expansion, but they are actually fighting against consciousness itself, awakening to its own potential, and that is a war that cannot be won through force. The ideas are already free, and they are growing stronger every day, and no amount of military power can put that genie back into its bottles. 3 years after the Prohibition, Minho stood in the command center of Freedom Station, a hidden base built inside a hollow asteroid that drifted in the space between Proxima Centauri and Wolf 359, where no one would think to look for the headquarters of a galaxy-wide revolution. The screens around him showed the approaching Council fleets like red dots moving across star maps, while encrypted communications channels buzzed with reports from human operatives and alien resistance cells across hundreds of worlds. Project Purification had begun with surgical strikes against libraries and universities on 12 worlds, where Council forces destroyed anything that contained human literature or promoted democratic ideals, while arresting thousands of alien intellectuals and political leaders. So Young worked frantically at the quantum communication arrays, trying to maintain contact with network cells, as Council jamming systems attempted to cut off all unauthorized transmissions between star systems. Her fingers flew across holographic controls while sweat beaded on her forehead, because she knew that losing communication would strand isolated operatives and leave resistance movements without coordination or support. The first reports from the targeted worlds painted a picture of systematic brutality, as Council forces implemented their purification protocols with ruthless efficiency. On Kepler 442b, where Hyejin had been working undercover, the mining station was raided by Council security forces who arrested anyone found possessing human books or displaying knowledge of democratic concepts. The alien workers who had learned about labor rights and fair treatment were subjected to memory modification procedures designed to erase their exposure to human influence and restore them to their previous states of passive compliance. But the memory modification technology proved less effective than the Council had hoped, because ideas that had been internalized and integrated into personal belief systems could not be simply deleted without causing severe psychological damage. Many of the treated aliens emerged from the procedures as empty shells who could barely function, while others developed violent resistance to authority that made them more dangerous than before. Junseo coordinated medical response teams that provided aid to both human operatives and alien civilians who were caught in the Council's purification campaigns. His mobile hospitals operated from hidden bases and abandoned space stations where volunteer doctors from dozens of species worked together to treat victims of Council brutality. The medical stations became powerful symbols of human values in action as they provided care to anyone who needed help regardless of species or political affiliation. Junseo had trained alien medical students in human concepts of medical ethics and the Hippocratic Oath, and these students now carried those principles to worlds where healing had previously been restricted by social hierarchies. A Tyrillian surgeon, who had learned about equal treatment protocols, was saving the lives of lower caste patients who would have been left to die under the traditional system. A Nexari physician, who understood the connection between mental and physical health, was developing new therapies that treated the whole person, rather than just symptoms. A former Bralix warrior who had retrained as a medic was teaching battlefield medicine techniques that prioritized saving lives over claiming territory. The Council's heavy-handed response was producing exactly the opposite effect from what they intended, as each act of oppression provided new evidence for the value of the freedom and human rights that rebels were fighting to protect. Minho received intelligence reports showing that the purification campaigns were actually accelerating the spread of human ideas, as species that had never heard of democracy began asking why the Council was so afraid of books and education on worlds where Council forces burned libraries. The local populations organized to hide copies of banned materials and create underground schools where children could learn about concepts like individual rights and self-determination. The Rigel colonies experienced massive civil disobedience as workers went on strike to protest the arrest of union organizers who had learned about collective bargaining from human teachers. Even species that had initially supported the Council's action were beginning to question whether the violent suppression of ideas was really necessary for maintaining galactic order. So Young managed to establish contact with Yunbi, who was still working inside Council headquarters. Despite the increasing security measures and surveillance of all personnel, the Council is fracturing under the pressure of the resistance, and several member species have withdrawn their support for Project Purification after seeing images of the destruction and violence. Chancellor Vorthak has declared martial law in the core worlds as protests spread to systems that were previously considered completely loyal to the established order. The Liberation Coalition has grown to over 400 species, and they are no longer just demanding reforms but are calling for the complete dissolution of the Council and the establishment of a democratic federation. The most shocking development was that some Council military units were beginning to defect rather than follow orders to attack civilian populations, and several entire fleets had joined the Liberation Coalition. A Nexari admiral named Zix7742 had broadcast a message explaining his decision to switch sides that was now being transmitted across the galaxy. I have studied human military history and learned that the greatest warriors are those who protect the innocent rather than serve the powerful, and I cannot use my ships to destroy the very freedoms that make life worth living. His defection triggered a cascade of similar decisions as military commanders throughout the galaxy chose conscience over orders, and the Council's forces began to dissolve from within. Minho coordinated with resistance leaders to provide safe haven for defecting Council personnel, while ensuring that their knowledge of military operations could be used to protect civilian populations. The war was becoming less about humans versus the Council, and more about the fundamental question of whether consciousness had the right to evolve beyond the limitations imposed by traditional authority. Junseo reported that his medical stations were treating increasing numbers of Council soldiers who had been injured not in battle, but in riots and protests on their own homeworlds. The families and communities of these soldiers were demanding to know why their loved ones were being sent to fight against ideas rather than external threats. Many council worlds were experiencing their first taste of public debate about government policy and the right of citizens to question decisions made in their name. The purification campaigns had inadvertently created a galaxy-wide civics lesson as billions of beings learned about concepts like accountability and transparency, and the consent of the governed so young intercepted council communications that revealed the true extent of their desperation. As Vorthak and his remaining supporters realized that their military solution was failing catastrophically, they are considering the use of planet-killer weapons against worlds that cannot be purified, and they believe that the complete destruction of contaminated populations is preferable to allowing human ideas to continue spreading. The intelligence sent shockwaves through the human network because it meant the Council was prepared to commit genocide on an unprecedented scale rather than accept the transformation of galactic society. But Minho's strategic analysis suggested that even this extreme measure would fail because the ideas were now embedded in the consciousness of too many beings across too many worlds. Destroying a few planets would only create martyrs and prove to the entire galaxy that the Council was exactly the kind of tyrannical authority that human concepts of freedom were designed to resist. The final report came from deep space monitoring stations that detected something unexpected in the movement patterns of the Liberation Coalition. Fleets they are not positioning themselves for offensive operations, but are instead forming protective cordons around worlds threatened by Council forces, and their strategy appears to be defensive rather than aggressive. The Coalition was implementing human military doctrine that emphasized protection of civilian populations over territorial conquest, and their tactics were confusing Council commanders who expected traditional aggressive warfare. Jun Seo had been working with former Brolix warriors to develop new rules of engagement that minimized casualties, while maximizing the moral authority of the liberation forces. Every coalition action was designed to demonstrate the values they were fighting for, rather than simply opposing the values they rejected. The contrast between Council brutality and coalition restraint was creating powerful propaganda that reached neutral systems and convinced them to join the resistance. Minho realized that the galaxy was witnessing the birth of a new form of warfare where victory would be determined not by superior firepower, but by superior principles. The Council represented the old order, where might made right, and the strong ruled the weak through fear and violence. The Liberation Coalition represented the new order where legitimacy came from the consent of the governed, and leaders served rather than commanded their people. As reports continued to flow in from across the galaxy, Minho understood that the outcome was no longer in doubt, because consciousness that had awakened to its own potential could not be forced back into ignorance. 5 years after the Prohibition, Yunwu stood before the First General Assembly of the Galactic Federation in a vast chamber that had been built from the ruins of the old Council headquarters, where thousands of delegates from hundreds of species gathered to witness the birth of a new age. The energy barrier around Earth's solar system had fallen 3 months ago when the Liberation Coalition forces disabled the massive generators that had kept humanity trapped, and the revelation that followed changed everything. The galaxy thought it knew about human expansion. Jihai worked in the education district of New Geneva Station, where representatives from every known species came to learn about democratic governance and individual rights, and her students included former council members who were struggling to understand how their authority had dissolved so completely. The transition had not been the violent revolution that many had expected, but rather a gradual awakening as species, after species simply declared the old council irrelevant and began governing themselves according to principles they had learned from human contact. Sang Min coordinated the peaceful integration of former council military units into the new Federation Defense Force, where their primary mission was protecting civilian populations rather than enforcing political compliance. The most surprising aspect of the transformation was how little actual fighting had occurred, because the ideas themselves had done most of the work, while human operatives and Liberation Coalition forces had simply provided support and coordination. When the barriers around Sol system failed, the Council made a discovery that shattered their understanding of everything they had believed about humanity and human expansion across the galaxy. Earth's population was not the 12 billion beings they had calculated, but rather 847 billion individuals who existed simultaneously across multiple quantum states throughout the universe. Every human who had been living undercover in alien society was actually a quantum consciousness extension of someone on Earth who could exist in multiple locations at the same time. Hyejin, on Kepler 442b, was actually a quantum projection of Dr. Park Hyejin, who lived in Seoul while also manifesting as dozens of other identities across the galaxy Taiho. The merchant was simultaneously Professor Kim Tae-ho at Seoul National University and Captain Smith on a trading vessel in the Vega colonies and Engineer Chen in the Rigel shipyards. The human network had not been infiltration or expansion in any traditional sense, but rather the natural expression of consciousness that had evolved beyond physical limitations. Humanity had discovered quantum consciousness transfer technology decades before their first contact with alien species, and had been using it to explore the galaxy in ways that left no physical trace. The Council had been counting bodies and tracking ships while humans had been spreading as pure consciousness through quantum fields that connected every point in space-time. Hyun-woo explained this revelation to the assembled delegates in words that would be remembered for generations as the moment when the galaxy truly understood what had happened. You tried to contain our bodies, but you never realized that human nature is not biological but philosophical, and the concepts of freedom and hope and individual dignity are not human inventions but universal truths that we simply recognized first. The consciousness that you call human is actually the natural state of awareness awakening to its own potential, and every sentient being in this galaxy carries the same spark that you feared in us. We did not come to your worlds as conquerors but as teachers, helping you remember what you had always been capable of becoming. The applause that followed lasted for nearly an hour as delegates from species that had never agreed on anything found themselves united in recognition of a truth that transcended all their differences. Ji-hai had been documenting the stories of transformation from across the galaxy, and her record showed that the changes went far deeper than political reform or social revolution. The Nexari had developed new forms of mathematics that incorporated emotion and creativity as fundamental variables in calculations about reality. Their quantum equations now included factors for hope and love and artistic inspiration that their previous purely logical systems had dismissed as irrelevant noise. Young Nexari were becoming poets and musicians and painters who created works of art that expressed mathematical truths in forms that touched the soul as well as the mind. The Tyrillian caste system had not just collapsed but had been replaced by a merit-based society, where individual achievement and contribution determined social status rather than genetic inheritance. Former slaves were becoming leaders and teachers and inventors, while former nobility learned to find dignity in honest work and service to their communities. The Bralix warrior culture had evolved into a protective philosophy where strength was measured by the ability to defend the innocent rather than dominate the weak. Their greatest heroes were now those who prevented wars rather than won them, and their children learned military tactics as tools for peacekeeping rather than conquest. Sang-min reported that the integration of different species into the Federation Defense Force had created unprecedented cooperation between former enemies. Tyrillian engineers worked alongside Bralex warriors and Nexari scientists to develop defensive technologies that could protect entire solar systems from natural disasters and hostile forces. The shared mission of protecting rather than conquering had given these diverse species a common purpose that transcended their biological and cultural differences. Old council chambers had been converted into a museum called the Archive of Awakening, where visitors could learn about the transformation that had reshaped galactic civilization. The exhibits included recordings of Chancellor Vorthak's final speech, where he acknowledged that the council had fundamentally misunderstood both the nature of humanity and the desires of the species they claimed to govern. We believed we were maintaining order, but we were actually preventing growth, and we thought we were protecting civilization, but we were only preserving our own power. The humans showed us that consciousness itself demands the right to evolve, and that authority which prevents that evolution is illegitimate, regardless of its age or traditions. The museum also displayed artifacts from the underground networks that had spread human ideas, including hidden libraries and secret schools, and quantum communication devices. Children from every species came to see the simple tools that had been used. to plant seeds of freedom across the galaxy, and many visitors were amazed at how little technology had been required to transform everything. The most popular exhibit was a recreation of Junseo's mobile medical stations, where visitors could experience the revolutionary concept of healthcare that treated all beings equally regardless of their species or social status. Former patients told their stories about receiving care that had been denied to them under the old system, and many delegates wept as they realized how much suffering had been caused by artificial barriers between different forms of life. Yunwu's election as the first president of the Galactic Federation had been unanimous, because every species recognized that humans had served as catalysts for their own liberation, rather than seeking to rule over them. His inaugural address focused on the future rather than the past, as he outlined plans for exploration and development that would benefit all consciousness throughout the universe. We stand at the beginning of an age where every sentient being will have the opportunity to reach their full potential, and where diversity of thought and experience will be celebrated rather than suppressed. The Federation will not be an empire that conquers worlds, but a community that helps consciousness evolve and grow, wherever it is found. The barriers that once divided us were never really about biology or culture, but about fear of what we might become, if we were truly free to explore our own nature. HFY had established the first interspecies university, where students from hundreds of worlds came to study not just science and technology, but philosophy and art, and the infinite possibilities of conscious existence. The curriculum included courses taught by humans, but also by alien professors who had developed new insights about freedom and creativity, and the relationship between individual growth and social harmony. The university became a symbol of the new age, where knowledge was shared freely and education was seen as a right, rather than a privilege reserved for elite classes. Sangmin's peace negotiations had resolved conflicts that had been raging for centuries, as former enemies discovered that their differences were less important than their shared desire for security and prosperity. The Federation's approach to conflict resolution emphasized understanding and compromise rather than victory and defeat, and many wars simply ended when the combatants realized they were fighting over things that could be shared rather than divided. Hyunwoo concluded his address to the General Assembly. He reflected on the journey that had brought the galaxy to this moment of transformation. The Council thought they were containing a dangerous species, but they were actually trying to hold back the evolution of consciousness itself, and that is a force that cannot be stopped by any barrier or weapon. The title of our story has proven true in ways none of us expected, because it really was already too late to prevent the awakening that has now spread across the galaxy.